Hey all, Tom Moran here from Tom's Big Spiders. Well, in my last few videos, I've been focusing on smaller tarantula species, some of the dwarfs, and I think I freaked some folks out with thinking that going on ahead, I'm only going to focus on smaller ones. Not true at all. I just want to give some love to the tiny guys. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at some of the giants. In fact, we're going to be taking a look at the 5 largest tarantulas I currently have in my collection. It's a question I get quite a bit when I tell folks that I have a huge tarantula collection. Hey, what's your largest one? And folks are usually in awe when I tell them. And I think sadly, in some instances, as much as I tried to catch the size of these guys on video, you can't really truly appreciate how large they are until you see them in person. However, hopefully this video here gives you an idea. I think that the larger spiders in general tend to fascinate folks, especially those just getting into the hobby. I know when I first got into the hobby, I was still kind of afraid of tarantulas, and the idea of the 6-inch spider was quite intimidating. The idea of a 9-10-inch spider, that just blew my mind. And I remember seeing my first truly giant spider. It was a Theraphosa sturmi, adult male, and I was in awe of the size of this thing. There's just nothing like it. And I know some folks find some of the larger ones to be the quintessential boring big brown spiders. I don't see how a spider that's 8, 9, 10 inches can be boring at all, but hey, to each his or her own. Now, as far as how we're going to measure them, in the States, we use DLS, or diagonal leg span. That's when we measure the spider from the tip of the front leg to the tip of the opposite back leg. I know over in Europe, there are some places where they measure body lengths. For me, I can't get a true feel of the spider unless I know the leg span. That's where you see the size from when the legs are spread out. So that's what we'll be using in this video to measure them. Also, because I did one of these videos about 2 years ago where I focused on some of my giants and we broke out the molts and we measured the molts, I still had those numbers, and a lot of those spiders have molted again. So what we're going to do is kind of compare what was the previous molt measurement, what was the latest molt measurement, and kind of see how much size they're putting on in between molts. A lot of times we use molts to kind of estimate how big our spider is. So we'll say, well, the molt was 8 1/4 inches, so the spider is probably 9. Well, in fact, they probably only gained about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch or so, but that's still good information to have. And if you consider a lot of the species we're going to focus on today live supposedly to 20 years or even more, that's a lot of years for growth. So those 1/4 inch and 1/2 inches will obviously add up, and that's maybe when somewhere down along the line we have the 10-inch or 11-inch spider. All right, enough of me talking. Let's take a look at some of the giant spiders in my collection. All right, to kick this one off, we have my adult female Pamphobedius antinus, or Big Black. I got this girl as a 4-inch sexed female way back in April of 2014. It was my first Pamphobedius species. I've been eyeing them for quite some time because, as I've mentioned many times before, when I first got into the hobby, I was really attracted to the giant spiders. I wanted something huge and big that I could show off. So at that time, she was kind of a brownish coloration. One thing I found really cool with this species is the fact that she's gone through several color changes throughout her life cycle. She started off as brown for about 2 molts, and then she picked up this jet black appearance, which she had for several molts. Then she went back to brown for a few molts, and then now she's back to more of that black coloration. You can see one of the things I love about the Pamphos is those velvety thighs. I just love how sleek they look. But this one, as far as size, her previous molt, she was 8 inches or 20.32 centimeters. Her newest molt, which was a few months back, was 8 1/4 inches or 21 centimeters. So she put on a decent amount of size. Right now, I would guess she's anywhere from about 8.5 inches or so, or 21.6 centimeters to maybe 8.75. It seems like they slow down a bit as they get older, and they only put on about 1/4 inch with each molt. So that's something to keep in mind when talking about the big ones, is the fact that once they hit that adult size, they're not putting on huge amounts of size with each molt. Now, growth rate, unfortunately, because I picked her up as a 4-inch female, I don't have the growth rate or how long it took her to reach, 4 or 5 inches in that first year or so. However, having raised several other species of Pamphos, I found that they all easily hit 4 inches or 10.16 centimeters in a year or so, or more. So for folks out there that had ones that grew even more quickly, I agree with you. It's just for this one, unfortunately, I do not have the data for that one because I got her as older. Now, as far as care is concerned, back in the day, Pamphos had a reputation for being very moisture dependent. However, I found that, yes, slings, you want to give them some moisture. Some of them will burrow down to get to that moisture. As juveniles, I do give them moist substrate and a water dish, but as adults, molts, they do well. What I usually do with this girl here is she has a nice, big, large water dish that I keep full at all times, and then I moisten down a corner of the substrate. And more often than not, she's not on the moist part, but I do like to give her that option, especially around wintertime where the temperatures shoot up, the heat kicks on, it dries out the air. I want to make sure that she has that option to be able to stay over the moist spots as opposed to the dry spots. But beautiful spider. One of the ones when I first got her, I had read that the Antinous can get to be 8-9 inches or so, and a lot of times we hear how large these spiders can get, but there's very little data out there to support it, or we hear some folks will come out and say, yeah, but I got one that's 10 inches, I got one that's 9, but they can't produce any documentation, any evidence of it. I was glad that I've been able to watch this girl grow. It does seem to me that 9 inches, maybe even closer to 10 inches, could be attainable with certain specimens. Remember, some just get larger than others, but Pamphobedius antinus, easily one of the largest spiders in my collection. Next up, we have my Firmictibus species South Hispaniola, or also known as Firmictibus species green femurs. I got 2 slings, or about an inch, way back in March of 2015. At that time, I was trying to grab up all the Firmictibus species I could find, and luckily they were all pretty inexpensive, especially compared to Theraphosa or Pamphos. So it was cool to grab these beautiful, large spiders. Now, growth rate, this one here, or all of mine actually, I've had 5 hit the 5-inch or 12.7 centimeter mark in their first year, so they put on a massive size that first year. And one thing to note I've found with most Firmictibus species, there seems to be a sprint to hit that 4 or 5 inch mark, and then they tend to slow down a little bit with the growth rate. Now, the previous molt for this one was 7 3/4 inches or 19.7 centimeters. Her newest molt, which was just last month, was 8 1/4 or 21 centimeters. So she's put on a decent amount of size. So right now, I would guess she's around the 8.5 inch or 21.6 centimeter mark. So a big, big girl, and very impressed because when I got these, I heard they could get to be around 7 inches or so. They've definitely exceeded the 7-inch mark, and they're still doing great and still growing. Now, as far as care is concerned, I have found all species of Firmictibus to be, knock on wood, pretty much bulletproof. Slings, they like a little moisture. Most of them will do a little bit of burrowing, so give them a little deep moist substrate to burrow in. Juveniles, I give them a water dish. I again give them some deep substrate. I keep part of it moist, and then the majority of my adult Firmictibus species are on mostly dry substrate, big water dish, and what I do is I fill up the water dish and I once again moisten down a quarter of the sub or so to give them a moist spot, and again, none of them seem to care that there's a moist spot there. And once again, in the wintertime, when things dry out, that's when I'm a little more attuned to the moisture levels. I don't want things to get too dry in that enclosure, but they hit like trucks when they eat, especially as slings. Slings are very active hunters. They put on great size. They're easy to raise. Temperament-wise, I know there's a lot out there about Firmictibus being particularly ornery. That has not been my experience with them. Specifically with my Firmictibus species green femurs, occasionally I'll get a threat posture, but it's usually if one of them's kind of in their standby mode and I drop in a cricket and it startles them. Other than that, they're almost pet rocks, which is amazing because as you can see this one here, this is an older girl. Some of those greens are starting to fade a little bit, but she's still got some of them. Gorgeous spider, massive spider. She was out on the side of her enclosure the other day and I was shocked. I put my hand up to her to see how much bigger than my hand she was. Awesome, awesome species. Definitely something people should look for if they're looking for big giant spiders. And what's better than a giant spider but a big giant purple spider? Here we have Firmictibus species Dominican purple. Back in the day, sold as Firmictibus species Goliath Violet, which is why I still want to call them Dominican Violets. But anyway, I picked up 2 slings back in July of 2015, once again when I was on that buying spree for everything Firmictibus. And boy, I'm glad that I did because these guys went through some of the most beautiful color changes I have ever seen any of my spiders go through. And a quick note here, you can see as I got the flashlight going trying to get those purples to pop, that I'm using a dubia. I usually don't feed these dubia. Some of my spiders won't take them, and as you'll see in a minute, this one here will let the dubia go. I had to fish it out later. But anyway, the growth rate was amazing with this species. Both of them, which were females, hit 4 3/4 inches or 12 centimeters in the first year. The previous molt for this one was 7 3/4 inches or 19.7 centimeters. Her newest molt was right around the 8-inch mark or 20.32 centimeters. So I'm guessing now she's around 8 1/4 inches or 21 centimeters. That is a big spider. And you factor in those beautiful purple tones, which stay quite purple through most of their adulthood. That's something I think a lot of folks think these guys fade out earlier than they do. This one here is obviously quite old, still showing some of the purple. Once again, it's a Firmictibus species, so the care is simple. They hunted really well as little slings. They grew quickly. They're easy to keep. Again, moisture for the slings, a little moisture for the juveniles. Keep them a little dry if you want with a wet spot, or even just dry with a water dish for the adults. They do just fine. Temperament, out of all my Firmictibus species, these are the most skittish. I've gotten the most threat postures out of these two. And Firmictibus threat postures really are amazing because they will throw the threat posture up and a lot of times flop over on their backs. They throw it up too hard. And it's hilarious to watch. And I will say one of the things I've noticed with my Firmictibus species when they threat posture, their fangs aren't out. Some species, their fangs are out. They mean business. They're going to tag you. These guys, they're in. It's more just a bluff. But you can see there the purples showing up on the femurs, the purples on the carapace. When these guys hit around the 5-inch mark, the carapace almost had a pink hue to it. Fun fact, the Tom's Big Spiders logo, sometimes I do a purple version, and this was the spider that kind of inspired it. And sometimes I'll use a picture of one of my old females just to back it up and show those beautiful purples, because again, nothing's more pretty than a purple spider. Well, blue spiders are pretty too. But anyway, Firmictibus species Dominican purples are just gorgeous spiders. They seem to be more prevalent now, and I always encourage folks to pick them up if they find them. And this one here is considered to be the largest tarantula and one of the largest spiders in the world, at least by mass. We're talking about Theraphosa blondi, or the Goliath Birdeater. I picked up 2 slings from Fear Not Tarantulas way back in April of 2016. And I will admit, after hearing how difficult these guys were to raise up, I was a little worried, but they've done just fine. I have 2 big, beautiful females, one of which is featured here. I tried to get the other one. This one here is in an enclosure. It's going to be getting a rehousing soon. The other one's in more of a naturalistic enclosure, but she retreated to her hide as soon as I tried to get footage. These guys are huge and they grow so quickly, especially that first year. Growth rate wise, that first year, my largest one hit 5.5 inches or 14 centimeters in the first year. I mean, we're talking about massive growth rate. It goes from a large sling that's big enough to be a juvenile of many species to something that's bigger than most adult tarantulas in the first year. That's crazy. And then her previous molt was 8 1/4 inches or 21 centimeters. Her newest molt was 8.75 or 22.23 centimeters, meaning she put on a 1/2 inch, so still putting on some decent size. So I'm guessing this one here is around 9 1/4 inches or 23.5 centimeters. That is a massive spider. And I know there's a lot of talk out there about spiders getting to be the size of the dinner plates, which is around 11, 12 inches or so. Let me tell you, a 9-inch spider is enormous. So I do hope I have her for many more years. I do hope I get more growth out of her. I would love to see a spider hit the 10-inch mark, but this is still by far the biggest spider. Well, maybe not by far. We'll get to that in a moment. But one of the top 2 biggest spiders in my collection right now. Now, care, these are a moisture-dependent species. They do require moisture as slings, as juveniles, and adults. The easiest way to do that is give them deep, moist substrate. My trick is, if you give them a lot of substrate, you can pour water down the side so the water goes down into the bottom layers, keeps the bottom layers moist while the top can dry out. That keeps from having overly stuffy enclosures, keeps from having the moisture that attracts bacteria and fungus and stuff on top. I give them, obviously, starter burrows. Both of these specimens burrow. This one here, obviously, her enclosure is a little smaller now, so she's giving up her burrow. But I got a funny feeling when I put her into her new enclosure, which is a 10-gallon tank that's going to have about 5 or 6 inches of substrate in it, she will burrow down like her sister does. Her sister, the reason why I couldn't get video of her, still uses her hide, which is awesome. She's out quite a bit, though, so it is a good showcase spider. This is the one that most people see when they're doing research or read about or hear on some National Geographic special or some special talking about, scary animals and stuff out there, and they hear about these giant 10 to 12-inch spiders, and they become fascinated with them. And for a while, they were difficult to find in the hobby. They were difficult to keep alive in the hobby. I have a funny feeling some of the issues were because people weren't keeping them well ventilated. They do require ventilation. You don't want a stuffy enclosure with all the ventilation closed off. I also wonder if a lot of the specimens coming in weren't wild caught. Wild caught specimens generally don't do as well in captivity as maybe captive bred ones. They seem to, as they're bred more and more in captivity, a lot of these species seem to become more and more hardy and used to captive standards or captive husbandry. But anyway, gorgeous spiders. As you can see in a couple of the close-ups, they're not just big brown spiders, although they are big brown spiders. They have those pink hairs on the knees. Love the Theraphosa blondie, easily one of my favorite all-time tarantulas. And again, I came into this hobby years ago terrified of spiders, and I remember seeing my first Theraphosa species, which was actually a male, well, it turned out to be a male Sturmy that I bought, and being in awe of this spider. And I think as I've spent, years in the hobby, there's very few of them that can give me that sense of awe when I see them, and Theraphosa blondie definitely fits that bill of one of those spiders that can really get me to remember what it was like to first get into the hobby and be working with giant spiders. And finally, we have the last spider on the list. This is Lasiodora parahybana, or the salmon birdeater, or salmon pink birdeater. This one here, unfortunately, I did not raise up from a sling. Billy picked this one up for me for my birthday way back in February of 2014. At that time, I believe it was a 3-inch sexed female. The growth rate on her has been excellent, though. As you can see, she is gigantic now. And I'll put up some footage of her molt next to the Theraphosa blondie molt. And although they're about the same size, you can see that the blondie molt is a little bit thinner. This one's a little more stocky than the blondie, which I found interesting. It's a heavy-bodied spider. But anyway, growth rate, the one I picked up as a sling, the couple I picked up as a sling, didn't grow as quickly as others have reported. I've heard other folks say that there's easily hit 4 inches or 10.16 centimeters or more in their first year. So I guess growth rate depends. A lot of folks do report that fast growth rate, though. Now, this girl here, as far as size, her previous molt was 8.25 inches or 21 centimeters. Her newest molt is 8.5 inches or 21.6 centimeters. And size-wise, I'm guessing she's about 8.75 inches now or 22.23 centimeters. So that's a big spider, pushing 9 inches. And I do want to point out that when I measured the molts, when the molts first come off the spiders, they're a little softer, they're stretchier. When they dry out, they tend to shrink. So all of these measurements of molts were after they'd been sitting out and shrunk a little bit. I do want to point that out because we could have gotten an extra 1/4 inch. But as you can see there, what I was pointing to is the fact that this enclosure is 10 inches across. She's somewhat relaxed. She's not stretched all the way out, and she's almost all the way across the enclosure. So just to give you an idea of how big she is. Now, care-wise, LPs are bulletproof in terms of care. I think they're one of the best slings to start off with, especially if you can get a well-started sling, because they do grow rather quickly. They're hardy. I like to give, like with just most species of slings, I like to give them the moist substrate early on. Juveniles, I did give mine, again, deep substrate, some moisture at the bottom. A couple dug, a couple of them didn't dig, and then as adults, they're pretty much bulletproof in terms of care. Dry substrate, water dish, they'll do just fine. I know some folks like to give them moist substrate. Nothing wrong with that. They're adaptable. And I don't see this one having any preference. Like earlier, I went moistened down half of her substrate, overflowed her water dish, and she stayed on the dry side. Other times, if it's, again, the heat's on, it's a little drier, you may find them gravitating to the water dish. That's a good sign, honestly, a tip that your spider craves more moisture. If you find them hovering around the water dish, that usually means they'd appreciate some moist substrate. But these are the ones that a lot of folks will get into the hobby. They'll read about Theraphosa species, whether it be Sturmy, blondie, Apothecis, realize that maybe they don't have the skill necessary, the experience necessary to keep these species, and then what they will do is they will read about this one here, the LP, that has that bulletproof husbandry, once again, and is just grows quickly and gets big. I know that's when I first scoped out the LP. It was because I really wanted a Theraphosa blondie, but didn't think I was ready for it, so I picked up an LP, thought this is great. It's a hardier spider that gets just as big, and you know what? I've developed a huge appreciation for them over the years, because look at it. I mean, just look at it. And you can see those salmon-colored hairs around the carapace and on the legs. Gorgeous. So this is probably my most accurate top 5. However, there are a few species that just missed the cut, or I couldn't get footage of them, but they're around the same size. one of which is my Poecilotheria rufilata. Her last molt was around 8 inches or so she's definitely over the 8-inch mark. My Firmictibus atachromatus also molted fairly recently. That molt was around 8 inches. And then my Poecilotheria regalis is right around the 8-inch mark, slightly over. So big spiders themselves. However, I would like to hear, what are your biggest spiders? I know somebody just posted up, I believe, footage, or it was a picture of a Acanthoscurria geniculata female that was well over 8 inches. That's a big spider. What else you guys got out there? Please chime in below. Let me know what your biggest species, or who your biggest species are, and what the measurements are. Do keep in mind, however, that if you come out with some crazy measurements, I am going to ask you to send me some proof, some evidence of it, because I've had folks come on and tell me, hey, I have a Theraphosa sturmi that was 13 inches. And then when I ask for a picture, I don't get it. Or my favorite Lasiodora parahybana that's 12 inches. I know they get big, but I've yet to see one that's 12 inches. So if you do put that, I am going to ask you to send me some footage of it, some pictures, something next to a ruler so I can get an idea for the size. And if you prove it, we'll definitely feature it on another video, because I think folks need to hear it. Can they get that large? Are there spiders out there that can reach that fabled 10, 11, 12 inches? I'm sure there are. I just don't think that it's particularly common. So that will do it for this one. As always, if you liked it enough to subscribe, very much appreciated. You click the little circle right up in there. I'm going to put the old Giants video down in here, something else up in here. I do hope that you take the time to comment with your largest spiders and their measurements. I will respond to them. I always do. It just may take me a couple days. Guys, that will do it for this one. As always, stay safe. Catch you all next time.